Hello, and welcome to the Mobile User Acquisition Show, a podcast to help you unlock tremendous growth for your app. My name is Shamant Rao. I'm the CEO of the boutique growth marketing firm Rocket Ship HQ and host of the podcast Mobile User Acquisition Show. In each episode, we feature experts in the field of mobile growth and discuss strategies, tips, and pointers from the leading edge of mobile growth marketing. By the end of each episode, you will have gained actionable and tactical insights that will help you make more informed decisions in your own work around growth. The Mobile User Acquisition Show is produced by Meryl Vincent, Content Marketing Manager at Rocket Ship HQ. Our first guest of 2022 is Faith Price. Faith heads the paid UA team at DoubleDown Interactive and has spent a large part of her career managing UA and ASO for numerous games. She has managed over 20 soft launches throughout her career. Yet, her most recent launch was a very unique and unprecedented challenge for her because this was the first one that she managed after Apple's introduction of the ATT. It was impossible to estimate results with no prior data points. Measurement was broken with scan. These were among the very many challenges which Faith had to address. In today's conversation, she pulls the curtains back on the many learnings which she shares in this interview. For a very instructive look at how the soft launch playbook has changed post-ATT, I highly recommend that you check out this episode with Faith Price. I'm very excited to welcome Faith Price to the Mobile User Acquisition Show. Faith, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I really appreciate you inviting me to be on.
Absolutely. Very thrilled to have you. Certainly, I think we connected over a year ago, even though we have crossed paths digitally, and I have a lot of respect for everything you've done over the years. So very much honored to have you today, Faith. The theme of our conversation today is going to be something you've done a lot of, which again, I'm very, very impressed by. You've worked on over 20 soft launches over your career, and you've clearly seen so much of what goes into launching hit games. And you've also been a part of a launch after Apple's ATT went out into the open. That is certainly what we're going to dive into today. To start off, what did you see different with the post-ATT launch? Clearly, you're looking at CPIs, right? What did you see the CPI trends as being? And why do you think the CPIs were the way they were?
I want to preface this by saying, our team went into this aware that we would be launching in a sort of an unprecedented time that we didn't have a lot of data on. That being said, we did try to do as much research as possible first. And this was also a new genre, since DoubleDown Interactive is primarily known for casino titles, social casino titles, and this was a zombie apocalypse sort of game. So went into it and did research ahead of time around where should we be launching, which soft launch countries should we be looking at. So we did a lot of reviews of what other similar titles were in soft launch, where were they in soft launch, how long had they been in soft launch, and then went to the partners that we work with for media and asked them to provide information on estimated CPIs for our genre, for our type of title, for those geos, as well as what were the top 10 geos in general for those type of titles. So we tried to get as much information ahead of time as possible so we could make some, educated assumptions about what CPIs should be. And really, again, where should we be? Because, soft launch countries can change over time. And especially in tier 3 and tier 2, there's a lot of movement around sort of technology and more people gaining access to it. We did want to make sure we were going in the right place. And what we found once we actually went out into soft launch was the information, the estimated CPIs from our partners was very much understated. Now, granted, they were looking at their historical data, even just looking back the previous 3 months, because we really hit soft launch about a month after there started to be the wide adoption of ATT. So it was still relatively new. And CPIs were as much as, I would say, the estimated CPIs we had were maybe 25% of what actual CPIs ended up being. Even when you're looking at getting those initial installs just to look at retention, not necessarily specifically getting into high value revenue sources. So for the most part, everything was just a lot more expensive than we had initially planned for it to be. I think it became especially predominant when we were looking at tier 1 geos. The impact of ATT was even more pronounced there. So we had really to evaluate once we launched and say what was going on, because up until 2020, I would say CPIs had gone up every year. And we talked to our media partners who even had said, we expect CPIs to go up a certain amount every year. But just the last 2 years have been a little bit of a wild ride.
Yeah, that's crazy. And you're right in that even if you look back 3 months before you launched, there would just have been no way to estimate what is going to happen. Also, thank you for actually describing the process of evaluating how you reached out to partners, we got these estimates, because again, I think it may be obvious to you, and it's obvious to me to some extent because I've launched a couple of games, but I do think there are a lot of people for whom it's not very obvious as to what happens before a soft launch. So thank you for actually describing that. So you guys launch and you're like clearly seeing CPIs that are way above what was targeted, what was budgeted. What is the impact of this higher than expected CPI on the rest of the soft launch process?
I think one of the impacts of it was the product team was more invested in getting information, getting indicators on whether or not this is an investable game faster, right? Because I had initially come out with what I thought was a reasonable soft launch budget to give guidance to the executive team. And then a couple weeks into it, here we are revising that considerably to say, we thought it was going to be one thing. No, it's quite a bit higher. And the other thing I should mention too, in preparation for ATT, I think a lot of game companies started shifting budget over from iOS to Android. And I can actually see that in the other third-party sources that I looked at in terms of like where our competitors were ranking in some geos and some platforms 3 to 6 months ago before ATT compared to now. So really, there was a spike in Android spending. The other thing we discovered was Android was becoming more expensive than iOS. We had an RPG game. We thought that we would do really well in the Android market versus iOS, because that's sort of traditional thought process around RPGs given their demographic. The challenge then we had to talk with the design team about was Android's really a lot more expensive. And so how are we going to view the game and the target audience, considering that the value of the player doesn't necessarily go up? Just because CPIs increase doesn't mean that the player increases. And so I think they had to go back then and look at their game and look at what sort of core loops did they have in their game and how are they monetizing, and take into account their LTV curves and sort of say, was their initial planning for LTV curves and demographics going to work in this new marketplace?
Yeah. So many unknowns, right? That I can imagine. I think something you said earlier on struck me as important, because you said you had to decide whether the game was investable or not. And all of a sudden it was so much more expensive to have to decide that, because ultimately that is the goal of the soft launch, right? So should we move forward or not? And like your budget for making that decision just went up massively, right? And we'll certainly talk about some other aspects of this. But I know we talked about the CPIs going up, but it wasn't just the pricing that was shaken up by ATT. It was also the entirety of measurement, right? And in soft launch, you're looking at obviously crash rates and so on, but also like how's your retention shaping up? How's your monetization shaping up? Based on my experience, it's completely disrupted. how did you approach measurement during soft launch with all of the realities of ATT?
So our decision was two parts. One was for iOS to limit the partners maybe more than we would have in the past. Again, as you mentioned, measurement's been a bit disrupted. And so the fewer partners that you have, the more confidence you're going to have in that information. And so we had conversations with a lot of partners who were very interested in working with us to soft launch the game. And we had to let them know that we really were being very, very conscriptive about how do we choose which limited partners do we want to deal with in order to make sure we get the leading indicators on the game. So that was one of the challenges. And I think for the other one, we really had to take a look at, for this specific type of game, how are conversion values going to work? So that's your other sort of leading indicator on the game. So
it's just hard to manage 15, 20 partners that we've done in the past with ATT and scan, just because you can't isolate the impact of each. And I think that certainly makes sense. We'd love to hear more about conversion values, right? So how did you guys approach conversion values? What are some of the criteria you used? Yeah, could you tell us more?
So I think the biggest challenge with, well, I won't say the biggest challenge because obviously there are numerous ones, but one of the big challenges with scan is they really tried to make it a one size fits all sort of environment. And that isn't necessarily conducive to every type of game. And so for us with conversion values, part of the challenge is you need enough data to determine what events in the game are actually indicators of revenue. For the initial soft launch and for most of the soft launch, we were just using one of the preset sort of revenue events that our MMP provided for conversion value. And we use that to help build up enough data to be able to determine, once we hit worldwide launch, what do we really want our conversion values to be? Because we work with custom conversion values. That's the only way really for, the type of games we do to get actual valuable information on the users. And I will say, in part because all of our games are mostly like IAP based. I think if you do a game that you're heavily reliant on ad monetization, then you're going to have a different experience potentially. With what should your conversion values be? That's where you really need to have a strong data analysis team that can go in and look at the data and look at all the different types of events and make those considerations on what your conversion value schema should be based off of. So soft launch, we had to recognize that we weren't necessarily going to have a lot of good data and then build in time before worldwide launch to actually change the conversion value schema, because that's one of the things that you don't think about. The extra work around scan is for some partners, once you change scan, you have to wait a couple of days, up to 3 days for your new campaigns to actually be able to launch. We worked with a fairly shortened and abbreviated soft launch period. So there was a lot of extra conversations between engineering and dev and the BI team and us to try to make sure that everything was aligned for worldwide launch for the conversion values. But mostly it was a data gathering time, and they were able to produce something in advance of worldwide launch, which is our current schema for conversion value.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's especially challenging for IAP focused games just because less of a revenue correlated signal. I'm curious, can you help us understand what you mean by custom conversion value? Again, to the extent you're comfortable sharing, could you talk about what that means? And even if that's a high level schematic understanding.
The reason we go with custom conversion values is we need to look at more than one indicator in a game. And in part because IAPs are a lot less frequent than almost anything else in a game. So you can't just go with a revenue event. I mean, obviously, the best indicator if somebody's going to purchase is if they purchase, but those purchases are a very small percentage. And when you're looking at scan, where you're already getting a percentage of actual data and not the full actual data, it sort of compounds. So what we've done at sort of a high level is taken other indicators in the game, whether it's a retention indicator or an activity in the game indicators. Like a lot of people, for example, would have levels in a game, right? So we're looking at things the user does that systematically moves them through the game, and then trying to divide those up into relevant bits that we can put an indicator on, and then also pair some of those with revenue and purchase events and what type of purchase event, for example, right? So somebody who maybe makes a purchase might not be as valuable, or that might be an indicator that they're not going to spend as much as somebody who makes a higher price purchase. And so trying to put multiple things into a single conversion value, that's hopefully get better indicators. Again, we're still talking about a small percentage because they have to do something in a certain number of days. Even though even though the scan values you can have them continue for up to 63 days. For us, that is way too long of a time period if you're most UA to be able to do anything relevant, right? So when's the cutoff point? When do we say stop sending me conversion values? At that point, the campaign is like the traffic that was actually responsible for those conversion values, and the market conditions maybe with that specific was responsible for those conversion values is now that was the other thing they had to figure out, was when do you stop and say, okay, anything after this we can't do anything useful with.
Yeah, you have to find that sweet spot, right? Because I know a number of folks we worked with were like, we're just going to take day 0 or day 1, depending on how you define it, because anything past that we just don't want to trust. But I've certainly seen a gradual shift towards expanding that time window. Faith, I understand what you said about custom conversion values. So what you're saying is you're looking at a combination of events. So a user finished level 30, watched 5 ads, and I'm making this up, right? Watched 5 ads and added a friend, and that complex event correlates to revenue, and that's bit 1. Is that roughly how you're looking at it?
That's very similar, but let's say we have the lowest level of a conversion value might be somebody who comes in day 1 and completes a level. And then the next one might be they come back day 2 and complete a level. They're in game day 1 and maybe they complete 5 levels. So that's going to be a higher conversion value than somebody who only completes 1 level. And then you start layering other things. Maybe they do tutorials or unlock mini games. And then eventually you get to, like, they've done these things, done some purchases. So those are going to be higher levels. So the way we tell our partners is around the conversion schema is like, you're looking for anything higher than X, like, here's the numbers that we have. Here's the conversion values for people who do things in the game but aren't necessarily spending. And then here's the higher set for people who do things in the game and do spend. And really anything above like this number is a indicator.
Sure, and that makes sense. So they have a clear target to shoot for, right? And with social channels, Facebook, Google, Snap, TikTok, it's not nearly as straightforward. You don't see conversion value 20, cost per conversion value 20, right? I'm curious, again, to the extent you're comfortable sharing, how does the approach to optimization or tracking conversion value X change for the social channels?
I feel like the world of attribution is still really in flux for social, search, etc. And I think we're seeing that, right, with even Facebook's relatively new move at the end of October-ish for the Android attribution. And the big changes they made there. It really becomes specific to the partner as how much leeway do you give them? We have specific reporting that's built to consider IAP, any data that comes in via IAP, any data that comes in via scan, and then do an amalgamation where we end up with a projected request. UA has become a little bit more, I hate to say fuzzy, but it is a little bit more fuzzy. Here's this partner's data, and we know historically that they tend to get a lot more reliable scan data. And maybe for some of the search and social, we still have some questions. So we're not sure that it's as reliable. So depending on the partner, maybe give them a little bit more leeway when we're looking at an optimization for a week where a number is down. The performance doesn't look like it has dropped suddenly. But the other thing is also, we do, and I think most UA teams do, like potentially a 7-day look back. And the data is just really delayed for some partners, especially social. So again, we have to look at what we've started doing is making sure we have like a weekly look back, maybe looking back for the last 4 weeks, right? And letting that data mature instead of saying, okay, well, really being focused on what's going on this week. Okay, well, how did it get better 2 weeks ago and 3 weeks ago? How did the data fit in? And we also really look at blended ROAS now, right? How is the product a whole doing? And, if as a whole it's doing okay. And I think this is easier because we have a product that's 10 years old, as well as a product that's 3 months old, to try to balance those out.
Sure. Yeah. And as you said, all of you has become a lot more fuzzy. And I think also the way you described your process, I would imagine the off-the-shelf MMP product in and of itself isn't enough, but please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you guys have to lean on a lot of in-house BI capabilities to do this. Is that a fair understanding?
We were set up because we always have. They've always looked at the data as it's come out of the MMP and made some assumption. We're taking I would say, a deeper look into it, especially because we have a 10-year-old product and so much, I would say, re-engagement in those cohorts. And so we already had a fairly robust internal reporting system set up. And so they then had to apply it to the new title. So I would say if we didn't have that, it would certainly be challenging. I would certainly have more questions about that data, which is really unfortunate because one of the reasons, like I came out of, I did a little bit of a stint in traditional marketing before I jumped sort of feet first into digital marketing and affiliate marketing. And one of the things I loved is there was a lot more lack of ambiguity around results. Like you could follow that path, and we don't necessarily care who that individual user is. We more care that it's a piece of data that we can say this particular data point says they saw this ad was X amount persuasive, which led to this result. Now, I do feel like there are some interesting things coming down the pipeline, one of which just launched with Apple, which is the custom product pages. And I think if I was doing a soft launch now, I would certainly consider, for iOS at least, having every partner go to a big custom product page, because I think, for one thing, obviously you can tie creative in through the entire user experience, the user journey, but also you would have a better understanding of those high level, top of the funnel indicators. And so that might provide a little more data. But one of the things you said is actually interesting. You were talking about the breadth of partners. And I will say over the past, even leading up to ATT, we've really looked at the potential partner base and media base. And we're a lot more strict around who do we agree to test with, because testing is just expensive. It's expensive in terms of resources. It's not just the monetary factor, right? And I feel like there's a lot of overlap too. So we really challenge the partners that we work with to show value. Like if everybody's buying off of the same ad networks, we don't want to be competing with ourselves. And so I think what I've seen from when I was first started in 2014 it's just a streamlining of partners that we're willing to work with, just because we haven't seen value if you're going ultra wide, you're just getting the same people.
Right. And if they're giving you 1,500 installs a day, oftentimes it's just not worth the time and resource to just vet them, manage them and all of that.
Yeah.
And I know, Faith, you talked about some of the ways you looked at measurement with scan. Something that's been talked about a fair amount post-ATT is non-deterministic measurement. And this is being proposed and talked about as at least a partial antidote to measurement challenges, right? So some of the things I've heard, and to some extent tested myself, have been more probabilistic attribution, MMM-based analysis, incrementality-based analysis or measurement. So are these the sorts of techniques that you've tested, evaluated, adopted, found effective? What has your experience been?
We've worked with a variety of partners who are trying a variety of things. And I will say for the time being that we have seen some partners who work with more probabilistic attribution be successful. The way we look at it is we're interested in trying sort of a lot of different things and seeing what sticks. We have not, I would say, built out our own probabilistic modeling, given our particular strategy. I don't know that that's something that we're necessarily going to be looking into. I think I've chatted with a couple of the larger game companies who have a full portfolio of titles who have been looking into like, what would that take to do a lot more of that internally. We have evaluated that with some of our partners and said to them, we're willing to try probabilistic or deterministic with you, but you have to have a backup plan for scan, right? You have to be using this data. We don't want to have essentially all of our eggs in one type of attribution basket. And if something shakes up the industry again, like you have to have a plan B that you've been working on that you're ready to roll out.
Yeah, and it's hard to know when Apple might just say probabilistic is not going to fly, because again, a lot of people will just call it fingerprinting. And depending on who you ask and how they define it, suddenly it could just all change very soon. Earlier on, you talked about some of the conversations you started to have with the game teams about when you saw the first data come back from the soft launch. So can you tell us a bit more about what it was like to have those conversations, perhaps with your finance teams, perhaps with your game teams? Certainly, I've had my share of debates and conversations with finance teams on what's reasonable and what's realistic. And in this somewhat unprecedented situation, what were some of those conversations like when you went back to the teams with the results, the elevated CPIs, the broken measurement? What was all the conversations like?
So I think one of the things that we did for this soft launch that was different than other soft launches I've been in is we had a lot more regular conversations with the sort of the larger marketing group, actually starting before soft launch. So starting a couple of months before soft launch, we had regular scheduled meetings, and all throughout soft launch and even after soft launch and worldwide. So as we were presenting results, these conversations just became part of them. So they had all of this notification and sort of real time, like we were getting it, that these costs were going up. And so I think the biggest impacts out of that was really talking about what does your LTV curve look like? And our conversation with them too was then, what does that do? Like with these CPIs, what does that do to our DROAS goals? And what we've seen, unfortunately, is there's more pressure on the front end to get higher D7 ROAS than there might have been a year or two ago. And so we've had to have those, like them saying, okay, well, if this is the marketing cost, here's what we really need to fit this LTV model. And us, trying to temper it and say, okay, well, realistically, this is the type of traffic and this is the type of performance we can drive. So, so what is that? But it's also informed because we have multiple game development studios under DoubleDown and actually with our sister company, W Games. How does that inform the next games coming down? And do we look at multiple monetization strategies. Like I said, like we're primarily IAP based, but do we need to think about focusing on some in-game advertising to help make sure that we're monetizing the fullest extent to cover the fact that our CPIs and the marketing costs have gone up? And then I also think it's potentially a higher bar for the game design itself, because so few games make it through soft launch to worldwide launch. And I've even seen some that have made it through soft launch and into worldwide launch, and then again, they just don't last more than a year or so. And so it's this higher bar. But we've also talked about things like shortened testing cycles. Like instead of doing a fully developed game, is there a new style we can bring out where we can do a smaller version of the game and make sure that there's interest around it so that we can cut down the marketing costs of the soft launch by not doing full-blown launches on games we have no data about, no information about in terms of whether or not the user likes the theme and the mechanic and the core loops. Looking forward, now that we have all this information, how do we do better for the next soft launch? And how does the development side of things, the design studio, make a better testing process for the games?
Yeah, and a lot of this is testing grounds and the learning experience, because I don't think anybody really envisioned what was going to happen right after ATT. And you talked about learnings going forward. I'm curious if there are any specific takeaways or learnings that you would point to as you would recommend for teams that would want to approach soft launches and testing going forward.
I think I would say a couple of things. One is do your research. Now that ATT has been around, there's a lot more data than when we're trying to soft launch. Make sure you can hopefully get more accurate estimate on what your marketing cost is going to be. Have those conversations in advance with the finance team and the design team. Utilize any of the new options coming out. I will say we didn't do it in soft launch because there's a lot of functionality that continues to be built into the game. But if we had like promo codes and things like that, I think those would have been super useful indicators as well for specific traffic sources. So when we do our next soft launch, what are the things that we can do around trying to help get more reliable information? If you're doing a soft launch now, make sure you know where you should be going, have better, more accurate estimates of the CPIs, and then try to put things in place to help get better information for specific traffic sources. Mostly it's throw out sort of the old book and write a new one.
Yeah. That's a whole new playbook that we have to use. And certainly you've explored what some of the components of the new playbook are with your first-hand experience. So thank you for sharing with us, pulling back the curtain on really what happens behind the scenes. Faith, this has been very, very instructive. This is perhaps a good place for us to start to wrap. But before we do that, could you tell folks how they can find out more about you and everything you do?
Sure. I am running around on LinkedIn, as most people are, but I'm also on a couple of the Slack forums. There's a couple of the mobile dev forum, and Liftoff does a forum, and then of course the AS Slack channel. So I find, I think with everything going on, it's really been even more key to have conversations with people all around the globe in terms of marketing. So I tend to frequent those forums and try to participate.
Certainly. And we will link to your LinkedIn, and certainly people can find you on any of the Slack channels just as well. But for now, this is perhaps a good place for us to wrap, Faith. Thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I will say one final thing, which is a little plug for my team. And we are actually looking at 2 open roles right now for experienced UA buyers. So if there's anybody in your audience who is looking for their next movie, would be interested in having that conversation.
Excellent. And we will link to that in the email newsletter, which goes out to about 3,000 folks in growth and marketing. We'll link to that right away. And it will certainly be in the links on the show notes as well. All right. Wonderful, Faith. So I will let you carry on. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thanks so much. It was great chatting with you.
For more tips, pointers, and strategies from the leading edge of mobile user acquisition, subscribe to our YouTube channel right here, or check out our blog, rocketship.hq.com/blog.